Switch to attack mode. Here at 229 Mark 4.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This is part 2 of the complete story of the B-Wing. I split it up since the B6 prototype is very different from the B-Wing that we all know and love, and is only new canon coming from the Rebels TV show. So this video will cover everything from the development of the ASF-01 B-Wing up to production. A full stats breakdown and comparisons, while looking under the Durasteel to see where everything was and how it all worked, as well as its unique history, leaving a legacy that would outlive the New Republic, while also being one of the most difficult ships to master. In that previous video we looked at the development and use of the B6. The Verpine species that ran Slain and Corporal would work alongside Sabine and Quarry to take this wild prototype that shorted out its own hyperdrive and turn it into a fighter that could be mass-produced. The most obvious change would be to drop that amazing composite laser. This was a move that was widely critiqued throughout the Alliance, at least by those who knew about it, as its destructive power was so incredible. As pound for pound, it was one of the most deadly starfighter creations. Even if it couldn't support a hyperdrive or even its own shields, I would have to agree with those who think that this should have been produced at least alongside the SF-01 B-Wing as a sort of variant. And it does beg the question why you couldn't at least just extract the weapon system. If the Phantom could carry it around, I think the power to take out an Arquitens in just a few seconds would be well worth it. But also, hyperdrives are one of the most expensive parts of a ship, and we saw that the Rebellion was adamant that this project could simply be too expensive for the Rebellion. Now legends has it that Admiral Akbar was the lead designer of this ship. In an effort to counter the increased attacks from rebels, the Empire initiated the Convoy defense plan. It was a better coordination of the movement of Imperial resources. Instead of having several individual shuttles or transport leaving at slightly different times, they would now all try to be in groups, and accompanied by starfighter escort. It was also called Project Shantipole in Legends, but would have Akbar contacting the Verpine and working alongside them to get the specifications right for a ship that could act as a more powerful starfighter and bomber. Imperial spy networks picked up communications about this new rebel fighter, and when they learned some of the specs, they were so worried about its effectiveness that they dedicated a ton of intelligence resources to locating the shipyard and capturing the blueprints. This eventually led to a battle between Imperial fighters and the first prototypes, a battle in which this first rebel squadron, Dagger Squadron, was victorious. But in both timelines, it would be year 0 that the B-Wing would hit mass production. So back to canon, the Verpine really appreciated that Quarry chose to use Slain and Corporal parts to make his prototype, and so to thank him, they let him name the shipyards the Shantipole facility. And as this was a Rebel Alliance fighter, and the first one to be produced here, it was called the Allied Shantipole Facility 01, or ASF-01 for short. And one of the main goals of this project was to replace the Y-Wing. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, they were already more than 2 decades old, with most being rescued right before they were turned into scrap. Each would cost the Alliance 220,000 credits, which was almost twice the cost of an X-Wing, and nearly 4 times the TIE Fighter. But what you got is a ton of high-tech and firepower. I want to start by pointing off something that's often ignored. The B-Wing had incredibly powerful electronic countermeasures, which would interfere with Imperial ships in a variety of ways that make it difficult to lock on and get missiles or torpedoes to actually strike the B-Wing. If it did get hit by stuff like laser cannons, then its Surplex ZR-41 shield generator would absorb it. It wasn't a Mon Calamari shield, it was made by the Verpine, but it's still reported to be one of the toughest of any Rebel starfighter. If we look at its cross-section, we can see that the deflector shield generator was located right in between the cockpit and the engine array, the 2 most important areas on a ship. We'll come back to the cockpit in a second, but we have the shield projectors and these nacelles on each side. This whole area was the engine unit, containing the hyperdrive array here, and the 4 main thrust nozzles over here. This was powered by a single engine, but that would exit through each of the nozzles in varying amounts for thrust vectoring. While this area would house the cooling system intake, but also the retro thrust nozzles that were important for slowing down in space, adding to that whole thrust vectoring idea to give it better maneuvering. The spine of the B-Wing would contain a lot of the tech, like the long-range scanners located here, and the jamming system, followed by the navigation sensor, wing status sensors, and velocity sensors. While the rest of the sensor arrays and ECM countermeasures were right behind this nodule. As for weapons, the B-Wing was designed to be highly customizable. Each of these 4 weapon points could be easily swapped out for other laser cannons or explosive ordnances. This isn't confirmed, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was a bit of a Mandalorian influence. Of course, their people are known for incredibly diverse arsenals that were often unique to each Mando. And we know that Sabine redesigned the weapon systems, so I could see how that makes sense. So it might be a similar concept. It's also great for a rebellion that didn't have the same steady supply lines of a proper army. If they were running low on Tabana gas for the laser cannons, or the opposite and torpedoes were harder to find, you can swap out your weapon systems based on the restrictions of supply, or just for mission-specific roles. allowing you to focus on any combo of ion, laser, or explosive weaponry. But the standard loadout was what we see here in the cross-section. On the end of each wing and at the base of the body are the Armech Sw7a Ion Cannons. These used a precision targeting laser, the thin cylinder located right next to it, which gave the B-Wing accuracy that drove the Imperials insane. Remember, this was hoped to replace the Y-Wing bomber, and it packed 2 separate proton torpedo launchers, one at the base and one right below the cockpit, with a total payload of 12 standard or 8 heavy torpedoes. Then we have the RX-9 heavy laser cannon also at the base. And we're actually not done. Attached to the cockpit is the Girl 72 twin auto blasters. This worked like a sort of chain gun, in the sense that it would just spray a ton of plasma rounds downrange in rapid fire. They weren't that powerful and had terrible accuracy with no targeting at all. But with this standard loadout, you had an incredible variety of weaponry to take on anything. While it is hard to forget the composite laser of the prototype, you can see why this was considered a worthy replacement to the Y-Wing, and pound for pound would be one of the most powerful ships out there. As the Arquitens being melted through in a few beams was impressive, but a ship like this was more reliable. And with a barrage from those 3 ion cannons followed by 8 heavy torpedoes on board, this could easily bring down a cruiser-sized vessel. And as you'll see when we talk about the history, it could even take on some bigger targets, while the autocannons could rip through the unshielded TIE fighters. So it's definitely more dependable than the prototype, and with those modular features, it was perfect for the Rebel Alliance. And if you're going to be a main starfighter / bomber, you really got to have the ion cannons, the laser cannons, and the explosives. Whereas the prototype was just one very deadly, but not very versatile weapon. But we haven't even talked about the positives and negatives of 2 of its most famous features. The first one starts with those wings. The wings extend from the body and contain the anti-gravity repulsor field generators that help to get this thing off the ground. Cruising, these wings would just stay folded up, but in attack mode they would open, giving you a wider firing arc, but also making it more stable when flying through atmosphere. One of the problems was that this S-foil feature could lock up, which could be deadly if you were trying to exit worlds and they couldn't open, or make it nearly impossible to land if you couldn't fold them back down. You'd have to force a really dangerous crash landing, coming down on that lower torpedo magazine. And then there were the complaints from many mechanics that said that even when it was properly parked in a hangar, it was too hard to service the areas underneath these folding wing sections. But to defend this ship from one critique, many believe that it took up too much room in the hangar, but if you look at the footprint of other ships, this isn't really true. At a length of 16.9 meters or 55 feet 5 inches, and a width of 2.9 meters or 9 feet 6 inches, it actually took up less area than the X-Wing or Y-Wing. The length was of course wider than the A-Wing, but it's pretty crazy to think that a heavy starfighter bomber like the B-Wing is actually thinner than that tiny Rebel interceptor. And so as we talk about that second main feature, let's take a look at the cockpit. Starting with the good. The main body can rotate a full 360 degrees around the cockpit, which would allow for a variable firing zone, as you could move your weapons around you without having to change your flight path. In a sense, this made it more agile, because you could move all the rest of the ship around while you were trying to make it through debris or terrain, again without having to change your path. Perhaps more importantly, is that this works as just another targeting countermeasure. You had your ECMs to electronically jam enemy targeting equipment, but because they all worked by zeroing in on the profile of the ship, when the B-Wing effectively changed shape, many targeting computers had a hard time coding if this was the same vessel. Right behind the seat was the life support systems and gyroscope that would make sure that the cockpit remained stable while the body was rotating. And then the cockpit has its own sublight engines, allowing the whole thing to act as an escape pod, with this nodule ejecting from the body in case of emergency. You wouldn't have your hyperdrive systems, so you couldn't get that far. But this concept was to address the shortcoming of the Y-Wing, because the Y-Wing couldn't re-enter atmospheres to make a landing. But with this whole cockpit doubling as an emergency shuttle, you could survive for a while with the attached life support, and use those sublight engines to hopefully navigate towards a friendly ship, or safely down to a planet's surface. So yeah, spinning really is a good trick, and the feature was great for both offensive and defensive reasons. But for most pilots, this was a great idea, but simply too overwhelming. Only top Rebel Ace pilots could handle the 360-degree rotating body, and all of the numerous and diverse weaponry, along with the complicated array of sensors and jammers. It also had no astromech support. This was something that the Verpine engineers pushed for, but Quarry insisted that this would both increase the price, but also tax the electrical systems. For hyperspace calculations, there was a navigation computer integrated into the controls, but this still required more input from the pilot than most other fighters. Luckily for the Rebellion though, there were enough excellent pilots to make several B-Wing squadrons. With enough flights, they were able to master this odd beast, and got comfortable working in their own customizations. The most divisive feature was the R9X targeting laser system. Some loved it, and some hated it. What was so genius about this system was that it would fire a very low power bolt at the enemy. It wasn't even enough to damage the enemy vessel, but the computer would be able to use the data gained from these shots to create one of the tightest lock-ons of any starfighter. Using this method, the B-Wing had a 97% accuracy rating, with both its ion cannons and torpedoes. That is ridiculously high, and remember, it was hard to hit this thing back with its ECM and rotation countermeasures. But the downside was that it revealed your position. Again, if it hit it, that targeting laser wouldn't do any structural damage to enemy ships, but astute Imperial pilots would see their sensors alerting them to some pinging in a certain direction. And so if they were fast ships like almost all TIE Fighter variants, they might have just scared it away with these low power shots. Many pilots preferred to just come in guns blazing with the incredible arsenal that it had, and actually remove the targeting laser entirely to put that energy toward other mounted weapons, often just being a simple medium laser cannon. But some missions would call for swapping out that entire lower nodule and filling it with laser-guided bombs. Wedge Antilles of Rogue Squadron fame loved his X-Wing, but he also was one of the best B-Wing pilots out there, using them to liberate an Imperial prison on Bakura, and later to take out an Imperial-class Star Destroyer in 2 BBY, while its most notable use would be during the Battle of Endor, where they were alongside the Millennium Falcon being piloted by Lando Calrissian. And Blade Squadron, which defended these things as prototypes, would use them to score several starfighter kills, and even take out 2 Star Destroyers, playing a powerful role in the Rebel victory despite being much fewer in number than other Rebel fighters and bombers. And then just to twist the blade, B-Wings would be used to lead the assault on Kuat Drive Yards, a battle that resulted in its capture, the Empire's go-to shipyard, and whose cronies were fine with using political alliances to extinguish operations like Slain and Corporal. And in the years that followed, there would be multiple variants that emerged, like the B-Wing E, for Extended, that enlarged the cockpit and added a gunner to help the pilot. Remember, the original prototype had a pilot and a gunner as well. Now they were just both seated together. And it was this model that Admiral Akbar used often. And then there was the B-Wing Shuttle. Same idea, but allowed for a pilot and 2 passengers. But this was more aimed at civilians, and only armed with light ion cannons. A year after Endor, they would be seen in the final battle against the Empire, over the desert world of Jakku. And once the Imperial leadership was completely fractured and their leaders reduced to simple warlords, the B-Wing would continue to fight against these disparate groups, sometimes including the forces of Warlord Zinj, other times defending the world Mon Calamari, and even have to protect their home when the fight came to the Verpine colonies in the Roche asteroid field. And they would be crucial to the liberation of Coruscant, going on to be an official part of the New Republic fleets, where they would then fight off the Yuuzhan Vong. After this, the galaxy was finally seeing long periods of peace, and many B-Wings would have their weapon points replaced with firefighting equipment, some returning to Endor to prevent the spread of forest fires, while others would be used in the dense urban environments like Coruscant. By 34 BBY, the First Order had made its introduction to the galaxy, and just 1 year later, the Resistance would rally several of these now older fighters to bring the fight to the revived Emperor's fleet on Exegol. In the memory of his father, Colonel Aftab Akbar would pilot one of these B-Wings, a ship that his late father helped to produce all those years ago. And its legacy would live on for several forms after this, like the AHS-1 Heavy Assault Airspeeder that was created from the wreckage of a B-Wing, and things like the Besh-type personal starfighter that was released by Slain and Corporal more than 100 years after the B-Wing was introduced. So that's it for the history and breakdown of the B-Wing, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. The ship was created for Return of the Jedi by Joe Johnston and Bill George. Bill was so involved with it that they often called it the Bill Wing, but it gets its name from the fact that these 2 new Rebel fighters were named A Fighter and B Fighter, and that's how they became A-Wing and B-Wing. But funny enough, they also resemble those letters. At least the B-Wing looks like a lowercase b, much like how the X and Y-Wing look like their letters. In the original version of the film, there were a lot less scenes with the B-Wings, as its strange shape was hard for the blue screen technology of the time, and so we got more scenes added with later versions, and there's still some great cut scenes. A lot of the details come from the book Star Wars Incredible Cross-Sections, The Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, Guide to Warfare, the Rebel Starship Manual, and then a ton of RPG guidebooks. There's also a really amazing X-Wing miniature, with a bunch of cards that add details too. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like and comment. That really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And be sure to check out the description below, where you can pick up cool Star Wars art and free audiobooks, as well as check out our Patreon and PayPal. For just $1, your name could be here. And special shout out to our $25 tier, Chris Garcia, Andrew Ban, Seraph Diaz, Cass Costello, and Carlos Velez. But most important of all, remember, when you have to pick the flashy prototype or the reliable starfighter, always go with the more dependable one, especially if it's still bringing down Star Destroyers. And the Force will be with you, always.